Uh-huh. All righty. So this morning we are joined by Dr. Christy Ridings. She is the Associate University Minister at Belmont and one of my cherished mentors. She has been really instrumental in my faith journey at Belmont, and I'm really excited to have her here today. So welcome, Christy.
Thank you so much, Jessie. I am kind of jealous that you guys get to hang out with Jessie all the time too. She's amazing. I'm super excited to be here this morning. I know that you have been doing, if I'm like, correct me if I'm mistaken, but you're doing a Lenten series, keeping sacred time and exploration of life's rhythms, which I always like to do this when I'm in my classes. Can anybody who's been here for any of the other classes give maybe a takeaway, something that has made you think a little bit more, something that somebody has said that has stuck with you? Anybody? I know it's putting you on the spot. You may not have even had your coffee yet. Anybody? Y'all are all thinking. Who all of you had here? Oh, just Dr. Skane. Okay. So Andy hasn't come yet. Okay. Well, I am very excited. I was very excited when Jessie told me about kind of this title of exploration of rhythms, mainly because I spend my life, my everyday life, helping particularly 18 to 22-year-olds navigate this idea of rhythm. And I love to think about life in terms of rhythm. Now, I want us to kind of frame our conversation today and talk a little bit about this idea of rhythm. It might even frame some of the things that you'll be talking about with some of the other speakers that you will have in. But I want us to start off and recognize that this idea of rhythm is something that God has put in place for us. If you look in creation, it is a great place where you see kind of the natural rhythms. Things don't bloom all the time. Things are dormant sometimes, and then they bloom. Things work and rest. A lot of the rhythms that we have and that we see in the world that are kind of there naturally that God has put in place to prompt us have to do with this idea of work and rest. There is time to work and time to rest. We see that in nature. Another good one that we kind of have right in front of us is this idea of day and night. Even the way that the earth moves reminds us that there's a time to work and a time to rest. We also have this idea of the calendar. Hopefully, you get some sort of Sabbath or a weekend during your week that reminds us again that we are created to both work and rest in this idea of rhythm. Interestingly enough, and I say this quite often to students, that humans are the only thing in creation that have the ability and the desire to kind of override the natural rhythms that God has put in place. I mean, think about it. If you, maybe my grandparents or my great-grandparents were farmers, and so they knew at the end of the day it was time to put away tractors and to go inside because they couldn't see to plow the fields. There was this natural inclination to when they knew to sow and when they knew to harvest, they kind of were prompted by these natural rhythms that have been put in place. And as technology has created opportunities for us, now when the sun goes down and it becomes night, we just flip on a light and plug our computers in and continue to work right through. So we have the ability to kind of override these natural rhythms that God has prompted us with. And so what that means, because we have the ability to do that, we have to be much more intentional about creating those rhythms, creating space for those rhythms, creating an intentionality in acknowledging the ways in which we are to live. Um, and so, one of the ways I think when we're talking about this intentionality, what we're really asking is this question of how am I going to shape, how am I going to live my life to be who I want to be? So how are these rhythms, how are the practices that I put in place, how is that going to allow me to be the person that I want to be, who God has called me to be? Now, I love, I've said my family were farmers and agricultural type people. I am not. I cannot grow anything. Do we have any gardeners in here? Really avid gardeners? Well done. I'm so glad that there are people like you, because that is not me. Um, but one of the things that I do know, I have one rose bush in my yard that actually blooms, that actually has lived through multiple winters. And the one thing that I know to do for it is when it gets to be time is to put a trellis. I love this visual of a trellis around something. Any tomato growers? Anybody grow any vegetables? Yeah. You put a tomato cage, you buy them or make them. And I love this visual because what it tells us is that when we do practices or have create some sort of rhythm in our life, it's much like a trellis in relation to the work of God. Now, you know that the trellis actually has nothing to do with the growth of that plant. It's not the soil, it's not the water, it's not the sun. It most likely would grow without a trellis. But what it does is it supports the growth that is already happening. And I think about spiritual practices and kind of our the ways in which we shape our spiritual lives in the same way that I think about a trellis. The work of God is happening. We're not bringing about something. We're not making ourselves grow in a way that potentially would not happen. But what we are doing is creating an environment that supports the work, that is more hospitable to growth. And so as you're thinking about these rhythms, think about them in the way that you think about this trellis. It acknowledges the work of God that is already happening in your life. And so, as we're thinking about this intentionality this morning, I want us to think about this word liturgy. Now, what do you guys think of? I am going to wait because I'm an introvert and I can sit in silence all day long. What do you think about? What are some images? What are some kind of phrases that come to mind when you hear the word liturgy? Responding. Okay, great. Say that again. The Bible. Okay. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Just the use of the Bible or? Okay, great. Anybody else? This side is making you guys look bad. I'm just saying. A guide. Okay. Yeah. Tradition. Yeah. Intentional. Disciple. Cycle. Okay. Sorry. Cycle. Somebody said something over here. Okay. When we think about the word liturgy, Jessie had told me this morning that she's actually serving as the liturgist this morning in worship. So thinking about the word liturgy, it actually means it's a Greek term for public work or work done on behalf of the people. Now, I like that definition, but I really kind of the working definition that I have in my brain that I use pretty regularly is the participation of the people of God in the work of God. And I don't know, I did not grow up in a liturgical tradition. We were pretty, I would say, lower church. Um, Although much of what we did was liturgical, it was not noted as such. And so when I grew up and I thought of the word or the term liturgy, these are the types of things, the images that came to mind, maybe for you too. More high church, more like pomp and circumstance, this idea of liturgy and liturgical kind of had a certain connotation for me. Um, I love this quote about liturgy and kind of the work. If we're talking about the work of the people in the work of God, Dallas Willard says this: transformation is actually carried out within our real life, where we dwell with God and with our neighbors. First, we must accept the circumstances we constantly find ourselves in as the place of God's kingdom and blessing. God has yet to bless anyone except where they actually are. So when we think of public work or work done on behalf of the people, or this idea that we are joining in the work that God is already doing, we're talking about in everyday life. I think when we have these images, when I had those images of liturgy, it always happened in a church. It was always, I only thought about liturgical or the idea of liturgy happening within the confines of a church. But as we know, God's work is not confined to the places that we label as sacred, but the work of God. Acknowledging the work of God is what makes a space sacred. So I wonder if we're thinking about liturgy in those ways, and we are defining it as our participation in the work of God, if liturgy actually looks a little bit more like this, happening in spaces like this. What if our participation as the people of God in the work of God happened in everyday, ordinary, maybe tedious spaces of our lives? Nowhere, I think, do we see a better example of making a space sacred in ordinary life than we do in the Psalms. So if you think about the Psalms, the psalm, when the psalmist is talking about, it's not a theoretical. It's nothing theoretical. The Psalms actually are, where are you in this moment? God, can I find you? God, what do I do in this moment? And it is using the everyday experiences to cry out to God. And so I want to ask us to think about what this actually means for us. And we're going to have a chance to kind of talk a little bit about this with your neighbor, but I want us to think about what this actually means. How do we go about making everyday spaces, using liturgy to acknowledge our participation in the work of God in where we find ourselves every single day? So maybe the question that we ask, we kind of shift our original guiding question is, how am I going to live my life to be who I want to be? To something like this: how can I participate in the work of God in my everyday life? And what I love about this question is that all of us in this room, our everyday lives look very different. And if I were to say, here's how you participate in the work of God, because it's the way I've done it, and it's the way that has worked for me, It does not acknowledge your experience and where God has placed you and the things and situations that you are in the midst of. And so when we are able to ask ourselves, how can I participate in the work of God in everyday life? You are able to actually think about where God has placed you in this season, in maybe it's work, maybe it's home, maybe it's both places, where God is placing you. If I were to ask you that question right now, I want you to think maybe 30 seconds. How can you participate in the work of God in your everyday life? Take about 30 seconds to reflect on that, and then I'm going to let us talk about it. How would you answer that question? What do you think? How would you answer that? Okay. Okay. Showing kindness. Yeah. 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 How you respond. Mm-hmm. Mm. 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 Thank you. Anybody else? Yeah.
The further I get in my own faith journey, the more I look at life sacrament, that the whole of life is infused with God's grace, not just parts of it. And I think what you're getting at here is trying to realize that aspect of that all of life is shot through with God's presence, and how do we become aware of that? Whether it's the mystery or the presence or the numinous or whatever it is. And when we stand back and look up, there's that great Norman Rockwell painting of a church on Fifth Avenue in New York City. And the pastor is standing at the top of the steps, and the sexton is on a ladder putting up the words for his sermon for Sunday. And down below on the sidewalk, people are rushing by, and their heads down and they're leaning forward. And the sermon title is Lift Up Your Heads. And I have a copy of that taped next to my computer. And we just kind of rush around and don't appreciate all that God's presence is. So I love that almost as much as I love your coffee steam. I am duly impressed with your technological capabilities, because I would have no idea.
I figured there was nothing more everyday than a cup of coffee. I'm not a coffee drinker, but apparently a lot of people are. I'm not one of them, but most people have at least one cup of coffee a day, if not multiple. So I'm glad that that is what you're taking away. Anybody else? Ways to participate? Yeah. Well, every morning, first thing I do when I wake up, reaching for the phone, checking work email. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. And I love that you said I get caught up in the busyness. I actually think that's just called life. I wish we lived in a world. I wish I lived in a world where all I could do was think about the ways in which God is working in the world and sit around and drink my tea. Mine would be tea, not coffee. But how we do that, and I think that's kind of what I wanted us to think about. Like, there's this idea that um, participating in the work of God only looks one way. Liturgy can only be done in one way, or it only looks a certain, it like has to have these certain attributes. And I want to kind of challenge us this morning and maybe challenge our imagination to what it might look like for us to think about everyday liturgy as not necessarily not picking our kids up from school, which I am going to encourage you to do still, not making me, not, foregoing eating or washing your clothes or brushing your teeth. Your family will really appreciate if you continue to do those things. Those of you that have teenagers know what I'm talking about. Please continue to do those things. But how do we meld this idea of everyday liturgy that allows us to think about those things and experience and participate in the work of God? Yes. Okay. You are better than me. That's amazing. Yeah, I get to do laundry. I'm going to try that today. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Expressing gratitude. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you for that. I am a very tangible kind of thinker. I like to have ways to things to aspire to, and maybe things as we are kind of sparking our imagination about this idea of liturgy and how we participate in the work of God. I wanted to give us maybe some starting points, some really easy places to start. I want us to begin by one thing that might be helpful is if we begin by accepting our daily circumstances. Now, I'm talking about those mundane things that we all know we have to do. We have to potentially, we have to eat, we have to sleep. Those are pretty hard and fast. If you don't, you know what happens. There are things potentially you have to do work. You have to pay in America. You have to pay taxes. There are things that you are going to have to do that of which, if you kind of stop doing, you are not either a good citizen or living or those sorts of things. So when we talk about our daily circumstances, that's what I mean. That there are things that we as human beings will need to continue doing that we might not find very spiritual. Raising children sometimes does not feel spiritual. Working at our jobs does not sometimes feel very spiritual, but we have to do them. So thinking about this idea of mundane daily tasks that we have to do and seasons of life that we have to journey through. That's kind of thinking about that is where we are. And I think, as some of you over here have said, begin to acknowledge those times as sacred. And that's going to look different. That is going to look different depending on you, depending on the circumstance. But when you see these circumstances as having sacred potential, and not just something you have to endure to arrive at somewhere sacred, it begins to change the way that we see those tasks. And that has its own set of challenges, for sure. Recognizing and acknowledging, if we are going to say that God is always at work in the world, and we are called to living liturgically and participating, not watching, but participating in the work of God in the world. What does that look like? What if God is always at work around us, and God's presence is what makes something sacred? Then those mundane things, the making of a meal, the driving to work, the sending of an email, becomes sacred space, and acknowledging the sacredness of those moments. And then finally, like, to live into this call, to understand what it means to not be spectators, but to be participants. To build intentional rhythms in the ordinary, the days, the tying of our shoes, the brushing of our teeth, the making of a meal, the sending of an email, building in some rhythms and some ways that they point us to the sacred of those moments. Now, I said that I like a good list. If any of my type A people out there, I love a good list. And so I want us to think specifically a few maybe easy ways for us to begin this. If that sounds very ethereal to you and you're like, that's great, you don't understand my job, you don't understand my family or kind of where I'm living or the challenges that I'm experiencing right now, here's some of the things that I want to give you as handles to think about this idea of liturgical living. We already talked about this, but you already have way more natural rhythms, more regular rhythms in your day than you think you do. Things that you could utilize, that you could put as part of spiritual practices that you don't even recognize. So how many of you have the exact same morning routine every single morning? You get up, you go to the bathroom, you turn on the coffee, you sit down, whatever. How many of you do almost the same thing every morning? Does anybody want to share that without getting too personal? Okay, right there. It's kind of universal. How many of you drive the same way to work every day? Yeah. How many of you shop at the same places pretty much all the time? Okay. How many of you go on vacations to the same place at the same time of year? No, just whenever you can. Work it in. You go lots of places. Okay, that's great. We have these rhythms already in place. One of the resources that I really love, and I have found that students really love, this book called Liturgy of the Ordinary. I highly recommend it if you're trying to dip your toe into this idea of liturgical living and what it looks like. What's interesting about this book is the author actually takes one day, all the things that are done in one day. So it is the packing of the lunches. It is the sending of an email. It is the driving to work. It is the, and writing liturgies for those things and acknowledging sacredness in those moments. A lot of people will say, like, inviting God into that moment. I am more challenged to say acknowledging the work that God is already doing in that moment, because I don't think we invite God into anything. I think God invites us into the process, but I think for us, it's acknowledging that sacred. So she goes through this, and she does it like in a time frame. So if you were to right now get out a piece of paper and write down all of the things that you do in a day and that you do pretty much every day, you already have some natural rhythms that you could utilize in thinking of creating spiritual practices. So learning to kind of leverage these regular rhythms, these daily schedules. We do it in church. We have the liturgical calendar. It's a natural rhythm that we use. We're in the season of Lent right now. That is something that we can already utilize, that we don't have to create on our own. So thinking through those regular rhythms. I think also events or activities that happen. So I've already mentioned a couple of these. When I was going through a season of my life where I was trying to become more prayerful, I was really wanted to learn more about prayer and be seen and known and know myself as a person of prayer. I was really challenged by that. And I had a really great mentor who says, tell me how you see, like, when do you know that you will have arrived as a person of prayer? I was like, well, I pray this amount of time in the morning and this amount of time at night, and I'm able to, and they were like, that's your issue. Like, when do you ever have that much time in the morning and that much time? Let's say you did an hour on each end, 2 hours a day, right? I know. See, you had the same face I had. But what if instead of thinking that you had 2 hours, if you broke it down into 5 minutes? Could you do that? And I was like, yeah, I could totally do that. And then because if any of my neurodivergent friends out there, you have to sometimes attach it to something or you forget to do it. That's me. And so what if you were to, instead of trying to get all of your praying into these large chunks of time, that you were to use the things that you do in everyday life to call you to prayer? I thought, well, I don't know what that looks like. So I started noticing my natural, like getting dressed, what those rhythms were, what I did every single day. I started noticing other things around me that called me to prayer. And so I began, this is going to sound crazy, but it works for me. I began tying spiritual practices to actual, like, everyday things. So I have a person that I pray for every single time I brush my teeth. I have a person that I pray for, or a thing that I pray about every time I tie my shoes. Now, some days I'm not wearing ties today, so it didn't happen today. But I have a friend who really loves shopping at a certain store, like loves it. That's her thing. And so every time I see the logo of that store, it calls me to prayer for that person. Now, that may seem strange, but what it has allowed me, what it kind of taught me and allowed me is that, and not necessarily just prayer, it could be the use of scripture or the singing of a hymn or something that allows me a spiritual acknowledgement of God's work in that moment. And so doing those things, instead of trying to do an hour, sitting down for an hour, by the time I've left in the morning, I have prayed for 7 people in my life. Depending on the way that I drive, if I drive by, there are actually 2 of these stores on my way to work, depending on which way I drive. So I've prayed for that person twice. And it allows me to participate in a way that is integrated into my life. Yeah.
Had two sons. They had two spouses, and then she had three grandchildren. And when I did a funeral, one of the grandchildren came up to me and said, "Hi, I'm homestead." And what Naomi had done was taken a day for each one of those children.
Yeah.
And that was just a wonderful way. And then they all, be out on Friday, on Saturday. And they knew that each of those days they would be grateful for Father.
And it can be a prayer, not just an intercessory prayer, but something that your Lord, may I join your work of equality in the world. Lord, may I be challenged to speak on behalf of those that are marginalized. It can be, God, give me grace. God, give me patience. Lord, teach me, these things that we are trying to. So it can be on behalf of somebody else or something that allows your liturgy to engage you in the world. So events or activities. And I think also a really good, easy way to think about it is what we do or how we engage with moments in time or seasons of life. And I mean that we go through these, maybe they're event precipitated. If you've experienced a death, you will go through a season of grieving. And how do we see the sacredness in a season of grieving? Or how do we acknowledge the working of God and participate in that when we are empty nesters for the first time, or when we are welcoming a new child, or when we are in transition, maybe professionally, there's a season of transition. And so recognizing the sacredness and finding ways to connect and to participate in that work. So that being said, what does that even look like? Like that's, again, it sounds very ethereal. Here are some things that we can use. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. You might already have something. As we're talking about this, things are coming to mind for you. Using scripture is a great way. The Psalms is a great place to start. If you're looking for something to pray or a passage of scripture that you can use, I recommend that. Psalms are great. Find a passage and use that and tie it to something in your everyday life. Maybe it's when you get in your car, you turn on your car. I did this like I'm 110 years old. I guess everybody does this now when they start their car, but use that. Use scripture, prayers. Think about intercession prayers, breath prayers. These things don't have to be long and complicated. It's ways in which we are acknowledging the work and participating in that. So having prayers associated that. Hymns, songs of praise. If you have a favorite hymn and great is thy faithfulness, that is a great one. Just to have in that moment to remind you and to make that space sacred. And then written liturgies. I am a fan, like I said, I did not grow up in a liturgical tradition, but I'm a fan of using other people's words when I can't find my own words. And so there are a number of resources out there that you could actually use to help maybe voice some of the things that you're expressing, actual liturgies that have been written, the Book of Common Prayer, pick up a hymn book if you don't, and actually read through those and see if any of those are useful for you. There are a couple that I wanted to just show you if this is your kind of first time to think about these things. They are Liturgy of the Ordinary that I've already mentioned. Every Moment Holy is actually a series of liturgies that are written for everything from when the electricity goes out to changing diapers to merit. I actually sent one of these. One of my colleagues just got married yesterday, and I sent him a copy of the On the Morning of Your Wedding, or upon the first, there's even one upon the first cup of coffee. So you could use that if you wanted to. Black liturgies is another one that I really love that gives me insight into experiences of others. The lives we actually have is another one that I love because it is not the ones we aspire to, but the messiness of everyday life. So these are a few that I use regularly to kind of borrow the words when I can't find them myself. Or you can write your own. You can actually sit down and think about your own experience and allow that to be the liturgy that you use every single day. I'm going to pray these three words when I drink my coffee, when I get in the car, when I hit the interstate. So when you're thinking of those sorts of things, there's lots of ideas for you to do that. But I want to remind us that when we talk about everyday life, particularly through the lens of liturgy, we're talking about active participation in the work of God, the acknowledgement that God is always at work, and our ability to join in that work without having to move to a monastery and be a good citizen in the world and what that might look like. It is possible. And so I want us to maybe, as you've been sitting there listening, I would love for you to get maybe in, like, just get with somebody around you as you've been thinking. And I want you to think about this question. Can you identify one place in your life that you can practice liturgy this week? Now, again, it doesn't have to be like spectacular. It can be when I get in my car, this is going to be my prayer. Or I'm going to utilize this hymn, or think through this, or I'm going to put on my calendar. If you're like me, if you don't put it in your phone, on your calendar, in your Outlook calendar, you forget. I'm going to put a reminder during my lunch hour to do X, Y, Z. So I want you to think about what everyday liturgical living might look like for you. And I'll give you maybe 30 seconds to think about it, and then I want you to group up with people around you and share. All right, talk amongst yourselves.
We're coming. I gotta go.
Okay.
Okay, I'll see you later.
All right,
Some point.
thank you for
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Thank you for not kicking me out. Make sure everybody in your group gets a chance to share. All right, take about 1 more minute. All right. I teach freshmen usually, so I get very excited when people like talk when they're supposed to and not when they're not supposed to and share. So I can't wait to hear some of the things that you came up with. We have maybe time for 3 or 4 people to share kind of your great idea. And maybe somebody else might also take your idea and use it in their life. So who has an idea that they would be willing to share? See, this is hard. Yeah. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yes. Hmm. 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 Yeah. And working in higher ed, I know that you're going to be praying that prayer a lot at this season of life. It's like daily, every question. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah. I don't do it anymore because it's really challenging for me and I should. Maybe it's a good Lenten practice. Before I hit send on any email, I had a liturgy that I would say. And I decided not to send a lot of emails because if I was going to send it, I was like, can't really say that and send that email. So yeah, turning on the computer, hitting send on an email, any of those things that I do every day. Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. Anybody else? Yeah. Yeah. Mm, yeah. Just scrolling. Yeah. And some days I get home and I wonder why my mind is so cluttered. And I have students do this as well, but I challenge myself. If you go on your phone into battery, this is just a pro tip for you. If you go into battery, it'll tell you how many hours or how many minutes you've spent on each app in your phone. And I'm like, oh, I don't have time. Really? Get out your phone. You've been on Instagram or you've been on the news this many hours. I've just cleared up 3 hours of your schedule. So, yeah, scrolling on the phone. Maybe one more. Those are great. Anybody else?
Listening earlier about, for our group, we raise children. We have children out of the house. They've done the college decision. We've also been there when they were 2. But just to be driving down the road and seeing some young mom who probably is saying the same prayers we did about patience, about giving the strength, and to observe God's work in her or in those parents that are, help with kids on an airplane. Special place. Anyway, but to observe the fact that they are probably saying prayers, and we're seeing God's work in them, so they are a reflection of God's work, at least an opportunity to pray for them to see thanks for.
That's great. Man, these are so good. Thank you so much. As we close, I hope that you've been able to take some nuggets of information from this to be able to think about these rhythms that you're creating, these intentional rhythms that we have to create. And particularly as we're thinking about liturgy, as it is happening in your worship, because we know that liturgy, by and large, is a communal response. It's communal. The things that we do in our worship service, we often associate that with liturgy, but it can also grow into our personal lives. And what we bring to those communal experiences is often reflective of what we've done in our own personal. So as you think about kind of your everyday life and the liturgy that you can be living into, I want to encourage you with that. And I thought it was fitting. This book really does have liturgies for everything. And so I thought I would close us, if you would permit me, to read a liturgy for leaving. Thank you, O God, that we do not walk this road alone, but that this journey towards eternity and toward your heart have been from the beginning one that you ordained we should undertake in the glad and good company of our fellow pilgrims. O Lord, make us ever mindful of one another. Thank you, O God, for the mercy and the beauty in the world and in acts of these your people extended towards one another. Let us therefore go forth and steward one another's stories. Let us journey from here together as a vessel of that mercy and as stewards of that wild and wondrous beauty that flows from the heart and mind of our Creator. Grant, O Lord, that we might take our leave of one another now, feeling a right joy for the blessings of this hour we have shared, even as we feel a bright and hopeful sorrow. By your Spirit, O Christ, make us faithful in the meanwhile, as we go out to labor in diverse fields to which you have assigned us, laboring unto better meetings and unto a new made world that is yet promised and has already begun. Amen.